Did you know that long before the rise of Rome, Africa was already home to complex civilizations, trading across oceans, mapping the stars, and building cities that rivaled anything seen in the ancient world? This isn't the Africa shown in dusty textbooks. This is the Africa that connected the globe. Let's go back thousands of years, before borders, before colonial empires, when Africa stood as a pillar of human innovation. At the heart of this story is the Nile Valley. Most people know of Egypt, but few realize that Egypt was deeply influenced by an older civilization to its south, Nubia, or what we now call Kush. The kingdom of Kush, centered in modern-day Sudan, wasn't a satellite of Egypt. It was its rival, and at times its conqueror. The Kushites built pyramids, more in number than Egypt, crafted iron tools, and ruled as pharaohs during Egypt's 25th dynasty. But Africa's brilliance wasn't limited to the Nile. To the west, along the Niger River, early settlements like Nok emerged around 1000 BCE. The Nok people were some of the first in sub-Saharan Africa to smelt iron. Their terracotta sculptures remain some of the most expressive in the ancient world. And they weren't isolated. Archaeological evidence suggests they traded across vast distances, connecting with people from the Sahel to the Atlantic coast. In the Horn of Africa, another story was unfolding. The Kingdom of Dam, and later Aksum in what is now Ethiopia and Eritrea, forged powerful connections with the Roman Empire, Persia, and even India. Aksum's merchants traded ivory, gold, and frankincense through the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Greek and Latin inscriptions found in Aksumite ruins show just how global their reach was. And then there's Carthage. Though founded by Phoenician settlers from modern-day Lebanon, Carthage became a distinctly African superpower, controlling trade in the Western Mediterranean and battling Rome in the Punic Wars. At its height, Carthage wasn't just a port city. It was a symbol of African maritime and economic strength. Across the continent, early Saharan cultures left behind cave paintings showing domesticated cattle, dances, and astronomical symbols, evidence of societies deeply in tune with the rhythms of the earth and sky. Africa wasn't a passive observer of global history. It was an active force. From iron smelting in West Africa to trade routes in East Africa, the continent was connected by networks of ideas, goods, and people. And while much of this history was erased or ignored during colonization, archaeology, oral traditions, and ancient texts are bringing it back to light. So when we talk about the foundations of global civilization, Africa was not just present, it was leading. This is just the beginning. Let's travel southward, beyond the Sahel, where ancient trade routes stretch through what's now Ghana, Mali, and Nigeria. Before there was gold in the empires of Mali or Songhai, there were proto-urban communities laying the groundwork, such as those of the Tichit culture in Mauritania, which date back to 2000 BCE. These people built stone-walled villages, farmed millet, and herded livestock in what is now a desert. They didn't just survive. They engineered sustainable societies in one of Earth's harshest environments. To the east, the Great Lakes region gave rise to powerful agrarian cultures that mastered banana and yam cultivation long before the crop reached Europe or Asia. And let's not forget southern Africa. Evidence of early mining and metallurgy has been uncovered in Swaziland and Zimbabwe, some dating back over 40,000 years. These were not random digs. These people understood the chemistry of their environment, smelting iron and copper with methods that would later echo in medieval European forges. Now zoom out. Look at the bigger picture. Africa was never cut off. In fact, it was central. The Red Sea and Indian Ocean were ancient superhighways, carrying African goods to Arabia, Persia, India, and back again. East African city-states like Rapta, mentioned by Greco-Roman sailors, were already bustling trading hubs by the 1st century CE. They exported tortoise shells, rhinoceros horn, and ivory, while importing spices, silk, and even Roman glassware. This wasn't accidental. It was strategic. African sailors navigated monsoon winds to reach southern Arabia and even India, centuries before the age of exploration. They weren't just reacting to history. They were writing it. And spiritually, Africa was a birthplace of belief systems. In Nubia, temples to Amun stood as early as those in Thebes. In Ethiopia, Christianity arrived not as a byproduct of colonization, but through direct ties with the Roman Empire in the 4th century. Aksum would become one of the first Christian kingdoms in the world. So much of this history was buried, not by time, but by silence. For centuries, colonial historians claimed Africa had no history before European contact. But stone ruins, ancient manuscripts, and oral epics tell a different story, one of movement, mastery, and memory. Africa wasn't waiting to be discovered. It was building pyramids, mapping the skies, and shaping the ancient world, long before others would catch up. And this is only the prelude. By the 4th century CE, Africa's story was accelerating. On the western edge of the continent, a new power was rising, the Kingdom of Ghana. Known to Arab traders as the Land of Gold, Ghana wasn't just rich, it was organized. Its rulers controlled the trans-Saharan trade, taxing caravans that brought salt from the north and gold from the forests of the south. Cities like Kumbi Saleh flourished, with stone-built palaces, mosques, and markets brimming with copper, textiles, and scrolls. But Ghana wasn't alone. Across the continent's northeast, Aksum was entering its golden age. By 400 CE, the Kingdom of Aksum in modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea was a cosmopolitan empire. It minted its own coins in gold, silver, and bronze. It spoke Ge'ez, built obelisks taller than modern buildings, and maintained diplomatic ties with Rome, Persia, and India. It even gets a mention in Byzantine records as a third great empire of the world after Rome and Persia. Aksum wasn't just trading ivory and incense, it was shaping culture. Around 330 CE, its king Ezana converted to Christianity, making Aksum one of the earliest Christian states in the world, centuries before Northern Europe. Meanwhile, Africa's eastern coastline was coming alive with maritime exchange. By the 7th century, a string of Swahili-speaking city-states dotted the coast: Kilwa, Mombasa, Mogadishu, Pat. These cities were Africa's answer to Venice, merchant republics fueled by trade. Ships from China, India, and Arabia docked at their ports, exchanging goods like gold, ivory, leopard skins, and glass beads. But these weren't mere trading outposts. They had coral stone mosques, multi-story homes, and a rich cultural identity that fused African, Arab, and Persian elements, creating the Swahili civilization, both African and global. And while Islam spread through these trade routes, it did so peacefully, through commerce, scholarship, and intermarriage. By the 8th century, African scholars were copying the Quran by hand and building mosques that still stand today. But perhaps the most underrated force shaping this era was iron. Across West, Central, and Southern Africa, ironworking spread like wildfire. From the Igbo Ukwu civilization in Nigeria, who created intricate bronze and copper art by the 9th century, to the Mapungubwe society in southern Africa, Africans were innovating metallurgy independently, designing tools, weapons, and jewelry that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe or Asia. And yet, despite all this, the myth persisted that Africa was isolated, that it was somehow outside of time. But coins from China have been found in Great Zimbabwe. Arabic texts describe thriving African ports. Greek maps show Nile tributaries and Saharan mountains. This wasn't a dark continent. This was a connected continent, a civilization that built, traded, worshipped, and wrote its own story, on its own terms. And it was only just getting started. By the year 1000 CE, Africa was not just a continent of kingdoms, it was a continent of empires. In West Africa, a new titan was rising, the Mali Empire. It began with a battle. Around 1235 CE, the legendary king Sundiata Keita defeated the Soso at the Battle of Kirina. What followed was one of the most powerful empires in African history, Mali. At its peak, it stretched across modern-day Senegal, Mali, Gambia, Guinea, and Niger. But Mali's greatest legacy wasn't conquest, it was knowledge. Its crown jewel was Timbuktu. By the 14th century, Timbuktu had become the intellectual and spiritual heart of West Africa. With its great library, Sankore University, and thousands of handwritten manuscripts, Timbuktu rivaled the scholarly centers of Cairo, Cordoba, and even Constantinople. There were books on medicine, law, mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Scholars debated theology under the shade of baobab trees. Students memorized entire texts before they were allowed to write, and then came Mansa Musa. In 1324, the Emperor of Mali made his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca. He left with a caravan of 60,000 men, 100 camels carrying gold, and so much wealth that he crashed the economy of cities along the way. In Cairo, he built mosques. In Mecca, he built alliances. The world took notice. Mali was no longer a regional power, it was a global icon. To the south, another marvel was rising. On the high plateau of southern Africa stood the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe, a city of kings built without mortar. Towering stone enclosures and conical towers marked the capital of a powerful kingdom. At its height in the 14th century, Great Zimbabwe controlled trade routes linking gold mines with Swahili ports on the coast. It wasn't just local gold. Chinese porcelain, Arab glass, and Persian artifacts have been found in Great Zimbabwe. Proof of global commerce, proof of connection. And on the eastern edge of the continent, the Swahili coast was shining. From Lamu to Sofala, the Swahili city-states were in full bloom. These weren't mere ports, they were architectural marvels. Coral stone mansions, ornate mosques, public baths, libraries. Swahili wasn't just a language, it was a fusion culture, combining African Bantu roots with Arab, Persian, and later Indian influences. They exported ivory, gold, slaves, and spices. They imported textiles, ceramics, and books. Cities like Kilwa became so wealthy that a Portuguese explorer would later call it one of the most beautiful cities in the world. Yet even as Africa reached this golden age, change was on the horizon. The 15th century brought new ships, new flags, new motives. Europeans had begun navigating the West African coast, searching for gold. But they would soon set their sights on people. Africa's global connections were about to be weaponized against it. But before that storm arrived, the continent had already proven something timeless. Africa didn't wait for the world. Africa was the world. By the 1500s, Africa was at the crossroads of global trade. Gold, ivory, salt, textiles, spices. Africa wasn't isolated. It was a pillar of commerce. But now, a new force entered the story. European ships began to carve the Atlantic like blades, arriving not just for trade, but for control. They came with new flags: Portuguese, Dutch, Spanish, British. The Swahili coast, once vibrant and independent, was suddenly under siege. In 1505, the Portuguese invaded Kilwa and Mombasa, looting cities that had flourished for centuries. The aim was clear: to dominate Indian Ocean trade routes and undercut Arab-African alliances. To the west, in the Kingdom of Congo, the story took a different turn. Initially, King Nzinga Nku embraced the Portuguese, even converting to Christianity and adopting the name João I. The kingdom exchanged ambassadors with Lisbon. Nobles learned Portuguese, churches were built. But that alliance came at a cost. By the mid-1500s, the Atlantic slave trade had begun. Congo, once a spiritual and cultural powerhouse, was now entangled in a trade that drained its people. King Nzinga Mbemba, known as Afonso I, tried to stop the abuses. He wrote desperate letters to the King of Portugal, pleading, "Our country is being depopulated. We need priests, not slave traders." But his cries were ignored. Farther inland, the Songhai Empire was rising. Built on the ruins of Mali, Songhai became the largest empire in African history, stretching over 1.4 million square kilometers. Its capital, Gao, was rich. Its universities in Timbuktu were still active. Its army was strong. But in 1591, a Moroccan army invaded with cannons, technologies Songhai did not possess. In one battle, centuries of knowledge were scattered like ash on the desert wind. Africa's strength wasn't vanishing. It was being systematically dismantled. Yet resistance burned. In Ethiopia, one of the oldest Christian kingdoms in the world, emperors like Gelawdewos fought off Ottoman and Portuguese encroachments while preserving an independent African theology and scriptural tradition. In Benin, the Oba's brass plaques told stories of defiance. The city had moats deeper than many European castles. Its palaces were grand, its governance sophisticated. Even European visitors were stunned by Benin's urban planning and art. And then there were the Maroon Kingdoms, formed by escaped African slaves in the Americas. They didn't just resist, they built new African worlds across the Atlantic. Africa didn't fall silently. It fought, adapted, negotiated, and protected its cultural soul. But by the late 1700s, the world was changing fast. The industrial age was coming. And with it, a new scramble for power, land, and bodies. Europe would soon redraw the map. But Africa's spirit, its kingdoms, its knowledge, its legacy, was not erased. It was hidden, waiting to be rediscovered. As the 1800s dawned, Africa stood on the edge of a storm. Europe had changed. The Industrial Revolution had transformed it from a continent of kings and cathedrals into one of factories, steam engines, and iron navies. But Europe needed more. More rubber, more minerals, more labor, and more land. So they turned their eyes back to Africa. What followed was one of the most aggressive land grabs in human history. The scramble for Africa. In 1884, European powers met at the Berlin Conference, a meeting held without a single African leader present. In just 3 months, they divided nearly the entire continent with rulers, maps and ink. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, each took their share like vultures at a feast. They claimed it was for civilization, progress, and order. But what followed was conquest. In the Congo, King Leopold II of Belgium turned an entire nation into his personal slave camp. Under his rule, millions of Congolese died harvesting rubber. Hands were cut off as punishment. Villages were torched, families were broken. Meanwhile, in southern Africa, Shaka Zulu had already transformed his people into one of the most formidable military forces on the continent. His tactics, tight formations, encirclements, short stabbing spears, shocked even British officers. But after Shaka's death, the Zulu faced new threats. Settlers armed with rifles and cannons. In 1879, the Zulu army scored a stunning victory at Isandlwana, defeating British troops in open battle. For a moment, African resistance stunned the world. But it wasn't just military. In Ethiopia, Emperor Menelik II took a different approach. He modernized, built roads, stockpiled weapons, and in 1896, at the Battle of Adwa, Ethiopia made history. Menelik's army defeated the Italian invaders, one of the only African nations to do so during the colonial era. Ethiopia remained independent, a beacon of resistance. In West Africa, the Ashanti Empire pushed back against British incursions. Queen Ya Asantewa, a fearless warrior, led the fight to preserve the Golden Stool, the soul of the Ashanti people. "I shall fight the white men myself," she declared, "even if the last of us has to die on the battlefield." Africa resisted in every form, with bullets, with diplomacy, with prayers, with silence. But colonization was a machine, relentless and efficient. By 1900, almost 90% of Africa was under European control. Borders were redrawn. Ethnic groups were split. Entire economies were restructured to serve colonial masters. But the soul of Africa, that remained intact. In secret schools, old languages were whispered. In hidden sanctuaries, sacred drums still beat. In the hearts of mothers and griots, stories still lived. Africa was being silenced, but it was not voiceless. This was not an ending. It was a reckoning. In the first half of the 20th century, the world shook. Twice. World War I and World War II weren't just European conflicts. They pulled in soldiers, resources, and labor from across Africa. From Senegal to Somalia, African men were drafted to fight in battles they didn't start, under flags they didn't choose. They were promised freedom in return. But when the wars ended, colonial chains tightened instead. And across the continent, a fire began to burn. It started with ideas. Educated in mission schools or European universities, a new generation of Africans began to ask, why are we still under foreign rule? Men like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and Patrice Lumumba in the Congo became the voices of this awakening. They studied abroad, but dreamed of home. They wrote, spoke, organized, not with weapons at first, but with words. Colonial rulers saw them as dangerous agitators. But to the people, they were prophets of change. In Ghana, Nkrumah rallied the masses under a simple call: self-government now. In Kenya, the Mau Mau rebellion erupted. A guerrilla war fought in forests and villages to reclaim stolen land. In Algeria, resistance burned for 8 bloody years. Over 1 million lives were lost fighting French rule. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress challenged a system even more insidious than colonization. Apartheid, a brutal architecture of racial oppression. But resistance came in many forms. Poets, teachers, farmers, and mothers all played their part. In Senegal, Léopold Sédar Senghor wielded poetry like a weapon, crafting the Negritude movement, a celebration of African culture, pride, and identity. In Nigeria, Fela Kuti's music would become a rallying cry against tyranny. By the late 1950s, the world could no longer ignore what Africa demanded. Not charity, not reform. Freedom. One by one, the dominoes fell. In 1957, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African nation to break free. Nkrumah declared, "The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of Africa." And so began a wave. By the mid-1960s, over 30 African nations had thrown off colonial rule. Flags changed, capitals renamed, maps rewritten. But liberation was never just political. It was cultural, it was historical, it was spiritual. Africa was reclaiming her story, chapter by chapter, and the world was finally being forced to listen. The 1960s weren't just about independence, they were about imagination. Now that the chains were broken, a new question echoed across the continent. What should Africa become? For some, it meant healing ancient wounds, restoring the glory of civilizations erased by conquest. For others, it meant forging a new future that had never existed before. And at the center of that dream was Pan-Africanism, not just a political movement, a vision, a united Africa, not divided by colonial borders, but bound by shared history, struggle, and purpose. Kwame Nkrumah called for a United States of Africa, one currency, one military, one destiny. In 1963, 32 nations gathered in Addis Ababa to form the Organization of African Unity, OAU, the earliest ancestor of today's African Union. But this renaissance wasn't just in politics. It surged in art, culture, and philosophy. In Senegal, Senghor blended French symbolism with African rhythm, creating something neither colonial nor traditional, but something powerfully new. In Nigeria, Chinua Achebe released Things Fall Apart, restoring African identity through literature. In Ethiopia, Haile Selassie stood as both emperor and symbol of African dignity, revered by Rastafarians in Jamaica as the Lion of Judah. In Congo, Frantz Fanon's writings challenged the soul of colonialism, asking what it means to rebuild identity after centuries of erasure. Music evolved too, no longer just traditional rhythms, but revolutionary anthems. Afrobeat was born. Fela Kuti's sound fused jazz, funk, and Yoruba traditions into a sonic rebellion against dictatorship and neo-colonialism. But as Africa danced to its own rhythm, storms brewed beneath the surface. Cold War superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, saw opportunity, and Africa became the chessboard. They backed dictators, fueled proxy wars, crushed movements that threatened their influence. In Angola, in Mozambique, in the Congo, Lumumba, once hailed as a hero, was overthrown and murdered. With foreign fingerprints all over the crime, hope battled betrayal. Vision collided with violence. Still, Africa pushed forward. New universities rose across the continent. Archaeologists rediscovered sites like Nok, Great Zimbabwe, and Mapungubwe, rewriting the history that had once been hidden. In classrooms, teachers began teaching African history, not European conquest. Children learned about Sundiata, Mansa Musa, and the Zulu kings, not just Napoleon or Victoria. Africa was reclaiming its past and imagining its future. The Renaissance was here. By the 1990s, the dreams of a united Africa were flickering, but not extinguished. For many nations, the decades after independence had turned into nightmares. Civil wars, military coups, debt traps left by colonial economies. In Rwanda, 1994, the unthinkable happened. The genocide. Over 800,000 people, gone in just 100 days. The world watched, then turned away. In Somalia, the state collapsed entirely. Warlords ruled, famine spread, and the US military mission failed, broadcast to the world in black and white headlines. But this wasn't the whole story. While the headlines screamed chaos, the ground was growing seeds of resilience. In South Africa, after decades of brutal apartheid, Nelson Mandela walked free. And then, he led the country, not into revenge, but into reconciliation. He became a global symbol. But more importantly, he reminded the world of Africa's capacity for forgiveness. In Nigeria and Ghana, democratic movements surged. Military rulers stepped down, some voluntarily, some not. Elections became more than symbolic. Across the continent, truth commissions exposed old wounds in hopes of healing them. But healing didn't mean forgetting. Artists, musicians, and filmmakers began digging deeper, no longer afraid to speak about corruption, trauma, or colonial legacies. The Nollywood film industry exploded in Nigeria, telling local stories to African audiences. No Hollywood filter, just raw, real African life. On the cultural front, something else was happening, something quieter but just as powerful. African spirituality began to re-emerge in new forms, not as relics of the past, but as blueprints for the future. Diaspora communities from Brazil to the US began reconnecting with ancestral beliefs. Yoruba traditions, Kemetism, Vodun, not superstition, but systems of wisdom. This spiritual revival wasn't just about belief, it was about identity. People began asking, who were we before we were told who we had to be? And in that question, Africa began to rewrite its own narrative.